By the late 1950s, more people were smoking than ever before, and more of them were smoking Marlboros than any other brand. Because Marlboro had made the inspired connection between cigarettes and one of our most powerful images, the quintessential American symbol of freedom and self-sufficiency. In 1964, smoking hit its peak. 42% of all American adults smoked, and it seemed as though that number would keep on growing forever. But in the midst of this growth came an event which stunned the cigarette industry and all of those who smoked. The 1964 Surgeon General's report on smoking.
The strongest relationship between cigarette smoking and health was in the field of lung cancer. There was a very strong relationship and probably a causal relationship between heart disease and cigarette smoking.
About 300 of us were gathered together then in the Public Health Service Auditorium in Washington, D.C., and at 10 o'clock sharp, the doors were locked. The deadline was noon, and no one was allowed to leave that room until it was completed. Then, one by one, the members of the committee presented chapter by chapter the findings of the report. Lung cancer up 700% among smokers as compared with non-smokers. Heart attacks up 212% among smokers as compared with non-smokers. I don't remember the figures exactly, but they were in this ballpark. And finally, at that time, 100 or 150,000 excess deaths per year among smokers, figures with which we are very familiar today, but which then came with world-shaking freshness. And as those 2 hours wore on, smoking in auditoriums was universal in those days. In fact, there were ashtrays on the back of each seat. But as the 2 hours wore on, you could see cigarettes going out all over the room. At noon, the reporters all rushed out. This became a worldwide front-page story, hammered on radio and television, and the result was what you would expect. Cigarette smoking declined immediately and abruptly. In Iowa, if I remember the figures correctly, cigarette sales went down by 30% the next week. And this was a worldwide phenomenon. It was the Great Forswearing, which was followed a week or two later by the Great Relapse, and cigarette sales went right back to where they had been before.
There was this assumption, I think, at the time of the '64 report, let's tell people it's dangerous, people are intelligent, they'll quit. What we found at that moment when we really said smoking causes harm was that it was very difficult to quit. And this led to a full reevaluation of what was the nature of cigarette smoking. Was it a habit? Was it an addiction?
Well, the anti-smoking movement is using this addiction argument for a couple of different reasons. One is they want to make smokers feel as guilty as hell. They want to make them feel like drug addicts, hang that placard around their neck, addict, and maybe they'll quit smoking. So that's one thing they're up to. Second thing is that they're really trying to get around explaining why 60 million adult Americans still are smoking. It's not because they want to, it's because they're addicted. That's the argument they're making. Well, that's very convenient. Nobody voluntarily chooses to use this product, which they're opposed to. It's only because they're addicted, and I don't buy that for a minute.
Scientific studies have shown that nicotine is one of the world's most addicting substances, and most smokers know that from their own experience. But many non-smokers act as though smoking is simply a matter of choice. Ed Brecker, who has many times tried to quit and failed, passionately believes that everyone should be told about nicotine addiction.
The concept of nicotine addiction should be planted in children beginning in the first grade. In the first grade, when you study about American Indians, they should know that the Indians were addicted to nicotine before Columbus landed, and when the early explorers took Indians back to London to exhibit, the Indians insisted on taking along not only their supply of tobacco, but seeds that they could plant so that they could grow more tobacco while they were in England. This is how smoking got started in Europe. In the second grade, when the children study the roots of the great explorers and Magellan's trip around the world, they should know that by then the sailors were addicted to nicotine. They carried tobacco and seeds with them, and they scattered tobacco seeds around the world so that subsequent sailors would have an adequate supply. And there is a marvelous story, which I think belongs in the third grade, of the Portuguese ship approaching an island in the South Seas where the tobacco crop had failed that year, and the piteous natives swimming out to the boat and saying, "Tobacco, kind sir, tobacco, we die without tobacco."